But just to go back to the decision we made a decision to suspend funding to UNRWA after there were allegations made about UNRWA employees having been involved in October 7th that UNRWA told us they found credible. And so when you had UNRWA telling us they found credible, we thought that was an appropriate step to do, to suspend funding, to fund humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people through other mechanisms while that investigation proceeded. That investigation is still ongoing. Okay, don't let me interrupt the fun. It seems like a good conversation's going on. Let me start with a couple things at the top. Secretary Blinken spoke earlier today with Qatari Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, to discuss the latest developments in ongoing negotiations to reach a ceasefire deal to the war in Gaza. The Secretary and Prime Minister discussed the remaining issues on the table and practical solutions to bridge the differences between the parties. The Secretary reiterated that the U.S. continues to see a deal as critical to bringing the hostages home and alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people, and that we stand ready to work to ensure that the deal turns into an end to the war and lasting peace and stability for the region. And then on a scheduling note, the Secretary will now depart tomorrow for Asia instead of tonight, as we had originally planned, so he can attend the meeting between the President and Prime Minister Netanyahu tomorrow here in Washington. We have, to accommodate that, reorder the schedule a little bit. He's now going to travel to Laos first and then on to Vietnam, but otherwise the trip will follow the same schedule that we previously announced. And with that, happy to take questions. Saeed.
Could you explain when there's going to be a meeting with the Prime Minister?
Between the President and the Prime Minister?
No, we know the President and the Prime Minister is going to meet them on Thursday.
Tomorrow, yeah.
There's going to be a meeting with the Secretary of State?
The Secretary is going to attend the meeting between the President and Prime Minister.
Not
a separate meeting, no.
Okay.
He had always planned to attend that meeting, but earlier, that meeting was previously scheduled for earlier in the week. Then, as you know, the President had COVID, has changed the schedule, so now it's happening tomorrow.
All right, let me start with where you began at the very top, on, that he spoke with the Qatari Foreign Minister and so on. So there's still, the outlook, or there's still, there are signs that a bit hopeful, right? That we might have something, or a deal arrived at maybe in the next few days, because we know come next month, the Knesset is going to go on holiday. We will enter the election seasons here and so on. So give us your assessment of how the talks are going and what might be the glitches. What are the obstacles?
So first of all, I'm not going to put a timetable on it, which I know you didn't ask for, but you referred to a timetable in the premise, so I wanted to say that. I think that we remain optimistic, but at the same time realistic, which is something you've heard me say before. It is important that we have reached a framework agreement and that the two parties, Israel and Hamas, have agreed to the framework that the President outlined publicly some 6-7 weeks ago. That was a critical step and a critical thing to get agreed. But of course, that's not a full agreement. There are still a number of issues that we need to work through. And we are working through those issues. Obviously, the negotiators themselves are discussing them. The Secretary discussed a number of them today with the Prime Minister of Qatar, who of course is one of the prime mediators of the deal. And we continue to work through and try to make progress on all of those issues. We want to see a ceasefire as soon as possible because it is the best way to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people, to get the hostages home, and ultimately bring an end to this war.
Mm-hmm. So, in a couple of hours, in fact, in less than an hour, the Prime Minister will be speaking before Congress, one of the most important places on earth. Do you think that he can, your assessment, will he take such an opportunity to say, okay, I am announcing that we agree to these terms and so on, with whatever caveats he might have?
I do not know what the Prime Minister will say in his speech.
Okay. All right. So in the meantime, Matt, the UN says that 150,000 Palestinians, flee the new assault on Khan Yunis. This is, it's almost like the Twilight Zone. We see these people moving from place to place and so on. I don't, somewhat apocalyptic, as a matter of fact. So how long should this go on? Suppose we don't arrive at a deal. What is the vision beyond the deal, if there is no deal?
We don't want to see the horrific suffering that's happening in Gaza go on another single day.
Right.
We want a ceasefire now. We want it as soon as possible. We want to see one reached between the two parties. And that's why we have been pushing for that for some time, and not just pushing, but doing the hard work of negotiating. And when roadblocks and obstacles come up, trying to develop practical ways to overcome those obstacles and present solutions to the two parties to meet Israel's legitimate security needs, and also ensure that Palestinian civilians are protected and they get the food and water and care that they need. When you look at the additional evacuations that have happened over the past week or so, it's heartbreaking to think of what those families are having to go through, to see children picking up and having to move for maybe the second time, maybe the third, fourth, fifth time, and to move from one place that hasn't been safe to other places that might not be safe. The suffering is unspeakable, what people in Gaza have been through, and that is why we continue to push so hard to get a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. I know this issue has been raised time and again on the issue of UNRWA, but the Knesset advanced legislation that would designate UNRWA as a terrorist organization. Now, UNRWA has been responsible for Palestinian refugees for a very long time, since 1950 or 49. So, do you envision like an alternative to UNRWA? How will schools be run? How will clinics be run, and so on?
Let me say a few things about this. First, UNRWA is not a terrorist organization, and we urge the Israeli government and the Knesset to halt the movement of this legislation. We have been clear about the important role that UNRWA plays in delivering humanitarian assistance and other critical assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and throughout the region, not just in Gaza. I think United States provides the majority of its funding for the funding for humanitarian efforts in Gaza through the UN. We expect to continue to do so. As you know, we are currently barred by statute from providing assistance through UNRWA, but that doesn't mean we don't support the work that they do, and we don't support other ways to get humanitarian assistance. So I would say, and you've heard us say this before, that the attacks that the Israeli government has leveled on UNRWA are incredibly unhelpful. They do nothing to advance the cause of getting humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. So we're going to continue to support the work that UNRWA does in the region, while also recognizing the need for reform, something that you have heard UNRWA and the UN also speak to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One last thing, if you could comment on, there's about UAE hosting a secret meeting with Israel and the U.S. for the day after. Could you?
Saeed, I think you were sitting right there when I commented on this yesterday.
Yes, I know, but I understand. But is there anything?
No, there's nothing I have that I would add, goes further than what I said yesterday. Which is, yes, there was a meeting last week that Tom Sullivan, the counselor of the State Department, attended in the UAE. We were discussing they were discussing a number of the measures that we want to have in place to implement the various provisions of a ceasefire and to set the conditions for the day after the conflict. And it's part of a number of meetings that we have held and discussions that we've held that the Secretary kicked off in January, and that the Secretary and others in the department have been leading for the past several months. Primarily focused on security, governance, reconstruction, but of course, as to the particulars of what was discussed, we will keep that private.
So
quite delicate.
Would you encourage like a UAE or an Arab peacekeeping force?
So I'm not going to get into publicly exactly the discussions that we are having with our partners about how to best establish security on the ground in Gaza. Obviously, security is critical. You've heard the Secretary speak to this a number of times. In the absence of security on the ground in Gaza, you will see the reemergence of Hamas. And so it is critical, unless you're going to have IDF occupation, which is something that we reject, something the international community rejects, and something Israel says it doesn't want to do. So it's critical to develop a security solution for Gaza. We're working with our partners in the region. We have made progress on it, but I don't want to speak to the details of that publicly.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
just a couple of things to follow up on from Saeed's questions. On UNRWA, didn't you announce a ban of before this congressional action, you announced that the administration would no longer be funding UNRWA, and as far as I know, never lifted that.
We announced a suspension of funding to UNRWA pending the investigation that UNRWA launched.
Yeah.
That investigation is still going. But in the interim, before the time that investigation was finished, Congress enacted a ban.
So your pausing of aid basically precipitated this, it seemed to precipitate a situation where everybody pulled funding from UNRWA, and now you're sort of criticizing other people for cutting off UNRWA, or criticizing the Israelis for cutting off UNRWA. But it feels like
that is not what I criticized Israel for. I criticized I criticized the verbal attacks and threatening rhetoric and advancing legislation calling them a terrorist organization, which we do not agree with. We've always made clear that other countries have to make their own decisions about funding, and we've seen other countries restore funding. We just simply don't have the flexibility to make that decision because of the action that Congress took.
But the investigation and therefore the decision of this department on whether funding should go to UNRWA from the US is still up in the air. Is there any expectation of when that will be finished?
No, it is because it's a UN investigation. It's not something that we are conducting, so it's not something that we can put a timetable on. They've had 2 investigations ongoing. Yeah. One of them finished, one has not. But just to go back to the decision we made a decision to suspend funding to UNRWA after there were allegations made about UNRWA employees having been involved in October 7th that UNRWA told us they found credible. And so when you had UNRWA telling us they found credible, we thought that was an appropriate step to do, to suspend funding, to fund humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people through other mechanisms while that investigation proceeded. That investigation is still ongoing. Now, in the meantime, as I said, Congress came in and enacted this statutory restriction that bars us from funding UNRWA. But all the humanitarian assistance money that we would have provided to Palestinians through UNRWA, we are providing through other mechanisms, chiefly at the UN and then through other non-governmental organizations.
Right, and also just on the question of the day after talks that Saeed mentioned involving the UAE. Some mention in the Washington Post reporting on that of the US playing a coordinating role with this international force that would be responsible for securing Gaza, would be invited in by the PA. These are obviously details I'm not sure if you'll get into, but I wonder if you could sort of address the possibility of the US playing that kind of coordinating role, and separately whether US security contractors could also be involved in that.
I just don't want to get into any of the details at all. I think it's not appropriate at this time.
Sure. One more slightly separate thing. I just on the trip planning that you mentioned, I wonder now that you're basically the secretary has decided to stay for an extra day to attend the Netanyahu meeting. I wonder what the message to ASEAN and to that region, to Southeast Asia, is that you're also that means that was announced yesterday that earlier in the week that he would be attending the funeral of the Vietnamese former leader. Now, not going to attend that funeral. It seems like the participation at ASEAN is much shorter than was previously planned. This is all happening because the Prime Minister of Israel has decided to come to the US. How do you square that with sort of trying to tell Asian allies, partners in the region, Southeast Asia, there's obviously a really important region, that the US is sort of all in on your region, but when a crisis happens in the Middle East, this is a meeting that's run by the president. Does the Secretary of State really need to be there?
So I think our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific understand a few things. Number one, that this is the Secretary's 18th trip to the region. It was his first trip as Secretary. Continues to be a major priority for us, and we show that not just by our words, but by the amount of time he spent in the region. And as I said, it's his 18th trip. I think they understand that he will be visiting all of the countries that we announced that he's visiting. He will still travel to Laos, to Vietnam, to Japan, to Singapore, to the Philippines, to Mongolia. And I think that demonstrates our commitment, as do the investments that we've made in the region, as do the partnerships that we have announced in the region. I think people understand that there was a meeting he had planned to attend, and the timing of the meeting got shifted due to something that's could not be foreseen. That's the president getting COVID. And I think they understand that happens. It happens to a number of foreign leaders where there are unforeseen events at home that mandate a slight shift in the schedule, but we will still be there attending the meetings that we intended to, and still traveling to Vietnam to pay our respects, not on the day of the funeral, but the day after, to meet with senior government officials. And I think our allies and partners certainly understand the importance we place on the region, and understand that we have the ability to do more than one thing at a time.
Sure. I think that obviously the Secretary's travel has been to the region a lot, but the President did miss the ASEAN Leaders Summit last year. That will also be in November this year. Do you have anything you can tell us on how the US will be represented at that one? Obviously ministerial this week, but the Leaders Summit.
The summit, no, I can't. I would let the White House speak to the President's participation. Obviously, that's still, I think, a couple of months away. But as I said, the overall presence of the U.S. in the region, I think if you look at what we said at the outset of this administration, how we plan to make a major investment of time, of resources, of energy and capacity in the Indo-Pacific, we have borne that out through our actions the past 3.5 years, and we intend to continue to do that for the next 6 months. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. We've been talking about UNRWA, and America it doesn't have anybody on the ground in Gaza. I just wondered if you had any comment about the rising cases of polio, a disease that's virtually almost eradicated from the rest of the world, rising in Gaza, and also hepatitis A. Is there any? We've seen American doctors have gone in there to volunteer. We've obviously got lots of aid organizations. Is there anything else that the United States can do to assist with reducing the risk of disease rising over the next months? It's like it's hanging a lot on waiting for this ceasefire deal, but
so obviously a ceasefire deal would go a long way towards alleviating suffering, because it would make it much easier to get humanitarian assistance in, get it moving around Gaza, make it much easier for people to move around Gaza free from the threat of harm. But we have not been waiting for a ceasefire deal to try to address the spread of infectious disease and to address the potential spread of infectious disease before we even saw these reports. Our coordinator for Middle East humanitarian issues, Lise Grand, has been incredibly focused on this. She has worked to try and get disinfectant products and cleaning products and vaccination supplies into Gaza. There has been, as you might imagine, a decrease in vaccinations since October 7th. You imagine how hard it is when people are not in their homes and are not going to school, how hard it is to continue with vaccination programs. So we have been working to try to get more vaccines for polio and other diseases into Gaza, as well as working on just basic sanitary supplies to try to deal with the very unsafe conditions that people are living in. So there's a lot of work that we have been doing with the UN, something that the Secretary discussed with Sigrid Kaag when they spoke 2 days ago. So no, we have not been waiting for a ceasefire. Obviously, a ceasefire helps make easier all of the problems that are plaguing Gaza right now, but we have been working on addressing the risk for potential disease for some time, even before we saw these reports.
And presumably those supplies are suffering from the same problems of not being able to move around inside Gaza.
Everything suffers from the same kind of threats to lawlessness that make it very difficult to move convoys from Kerem Shalom into to places in southern Gaza or other places, moving around northern Gaza.
And now with the pier being out of operation, are airdrops continuing at all with the U.S., or is that?
I'm not aware of any, but I would defer to the Pentagon to speak to that.